Hello everyone, thank you very much for coming. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present or watching today. Well, what a year it's been. A year ago, I put some work clothes on, got into my car, drove to my office, dropped off my son, spoke to my elderly mother in a nursing home, and went to work. In the past year, every single aspect of my life has changed. This morning, I got up, put on some work clothes, discovered they appear to have mysteriously shrunk in the past year. I'm not sure why. And came in today, and it's the first time I've been into the city, apart from coming in to do some shopping or some chores, for an entire year. And in that time, my life has changed irrevocably. So we all need some tips and tools on how to cope with the sudden change. So we'd like to welcome you all to the third event in the Australian College of Applied Psychology's inaugural Get Equipped speaker series. ACAP has created this series as a way to give back and support all of us and provide tools and takeaways to support our own mental health while we, in turn, support others. This is the third event in the four-part series, which is being held throughout the month of February here at the Sydney Startup Hub near Wynyard Station. So this particular event focuses on the change that organisations have been through due to the events of 2020 and give us all practical tips and tools to future-proof your organisation, your career and your life. And I'd like to begin this series by handing over to George Garrop, ACAP CEO. So welcome, George.
Thank you, Margot, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here, and I'm actually pleased that we are at the third in our speaker series, because as we know, in other states we've had interruptions, and that's been now the new normal for us in all of our operations. So it's great to be here. I really appreciate everybody who's logged in, and also those who are here in person, which is, again, an unusual sight for today. So thank you.
So George, can you give us some idea of how we're going to cope with these terrible changes?
Very good. I'm here today to share perhaps a story of ACAP over the last 12 months. This speaker series started with a discussion of the individual, a discussion of how the communities responded, and now today, through my sharing, I'm hoping to share a story of how ACAP as an organisation survived. ACAP itself is an old college. It's 38 years old. It's had a number of different forms. Funnily enough, we're in premises where ACAP used to operate. So many years ago, we were here at the Wynyard Green premises, as they were then known. But one thing about ACAP during that whole time is it's been made up of people. It's personified itself. It's had emotions. It's had up and downs. And also it's been human to the core. This is a statement that's often thrown about for organisations, but I can say through my work history, I found ACAP to be the most human of organisations I've worked at, and that's in part to the staff that are there, but in part to how the college itself expresses itself. We've got staff who've been there 25 years, and we've got staff who started last month. It's an amazing collection of people, and with that collection we're able to teach and guide students through their learning journey in a way and with a variety that I've just never seen in an organisation before. 12 years ago we went online, and that becomes relevant a bit later. We were quite an early innovator. The college itself was one of the largest, and still remains one of the largest institutions teaching counselling in Australia. And with that history, we like to think that that innovation has not come through structures, organisations and strategies, but has actually come through our people. Our people have identified the need, our people have found a way to add to their workload and found a way to create these new and amazing paradigms that otherwise would never have occurred. But in all of that, we also had to face COVID like everybody else. The last 12 months has not been an easy journey for the college, and what I'm hoping to share today is some sense of how our organisation responded and some sense of how our college got through what was a very challenging period. Forgive me for looking at my notes. Part of this journey for me as a leader was to not just listen to the team and think about what I thought we should do, but was to actually go to evidence-based research. We searched high and low. We're lucky enough to have organisational psychologists within our organisation, but we found a great model, which is the Dr. William Bridges model of managing transitions. This model is 30 years old. It's quite an established model around the world, but importantly, what it does is it recognises the difference between change and transitions. We could see that in the circumstances, the model itself was going to help our team understand and how to get through some of the challenges that we were seeing in the marketplace. Something as simple as your example this morning, Margot, was something faced by our team every single day. And that's something that both our students and our staff had to face. So I'll talk a little bit about the Bridges model and then perhaps get into how we adapted it within ACAP. The Bridges model itself is really focused on endings. So it has 3 distinct stages. It has a stage of endings, a neutral zone, and then new beginnings. And the reason there's that focus on endings is because to start a process of change is also to recognise that you have to end something. You have to end your old process. Maybe you have to sit in a different seat. You have to end an old structure. You have to forget things and be at peace with letting things go. So it's recognising that people have to let things go, not just start new things. And it's this understanding of a transition that helps you realise that it is a deep internal process for every member of staff, and that by helping staff understand what to end and what to let go of, you actually help them prepare for new beginnings. This to me was a pivotal point. A typical change program focuses on the future immediately. Here we wanted to give our team a chance to end their old existence. We then move from endings to the neutral zone, and the neutral zone is very challenging because it's that limbo between letting go of the old and yet you haven't yet quite discovered what the new is. So you are in that limbo. You're uncomfortable, and during this period is when we provided as much support as we could for our team, recognising that they were in this space where they'd let go of their old processes, perhaps even old colleagues, but they weren't quite ready to start with the new. And it was this period that needed to happen. We needed to give it weeks. We needed people to settle into this idea that new was coming, but not to force new onto them. And then that does bring us to new beginnings. Having allowed staff to let go of their old processes, having given them time to think about that that period where one prepares for new things, but yet holding off the new things, I found that was vital, and certainly the feedback we got was that was vital in helping staff then bring a new energy to the new process, helping them bring a new vitality and an eagerness to learn about the new thing. What's my new process? What's my new structure? Who am I sitting next to? And how's that going to impact me? This is all going on while we're at home. So COVID's happening, and we're having to do this a little bit like our webinar gets today, on screen. So we're not able to sit and have a coffee. We're not able to get the nuance of how people are feeling in the room. We're having to do it all on screen. So it's fair to say it was challenging, but the Bridges model also brings in a human element, which is staff-led change. Staff-led change in the Bridges model is a way to help staff understand that it's their own journey that is important, that the ground-up motivation comes from them. It comes from the individual, it builds into teams, and then it aggregates into a college. It is not a top-down directive. If I've participated in a lot of top-down directives, I've been through change processes that have not gone well. I like to think that ours was a contrast to that, and I say that because everybody had to find their new beginnings, everybody had to find their inner motivation, and then the college benefited from the aggregation of that motivation, not from a top-down directive. I don't want to think about what might have happened had we done it the typical way. You will do this, you must do that. That's just not the way it would have worked. The staff-led transition also called on us to form a staff team. So within the Bridges transition model, there's a thing called a transition support team, which is made up of a cross-section of staff from all different parts of the business, and they are there to listen, they're there to conduct surveys, they're there to be confidential, they're there to help management understand what's actually going on. Because this is one of the biggest challenges for my role. I'm lucky enough to be senior in an organisation, but what that cuts out is sometimes the real message. So I might say, how are you? You will give me the message you believe you need to give me because I'm in a senior role. What we look to do with the transition support team is to have the real messages go to them, and then those messages fed up in a depersonalised way to management so that we can understand that the changes we are making, what are the actual effects on the ground? It's very often the case that through hierarchical channels and through the typical response mechanisms, when a CEO asks, how are things going, everybody nods and smiles politely and they say it's going fine. That's not the message we want to hear. We need to hear the reality. As a manager, I need to accept the reality of what's going on, not what I think is going on. And that gap, if we can shrink that gap, then you are putting yourself in a position where you can succeed. The transition support team is still in place. They're a bit busy. They don't meet as often as we'd like, but they are still in place, and their goal is to help us understand, their goal is to help management understand what's really going on and what are the real effects of the changes we're making rather than the effects that we think. And I think that's an important gap. I want to talk a little bit about so after we did the research and after we conducted surveys, we could see that there were 3 areas that really ultimately made an impact. And I thank everyone for sticking with me. I'll make these quick. We adapted well. So COVID hit, and it hit us like it hit every other business. Top line was hit, people were hit, we had to make really horrible and tough decisions, but we had to stay alive. Once we did that, what we understood was we had a muscle in adaptability. So one example within our college was we'd been an online innovator. So 12 years ago, somebody smart decided online learning was the way to go. We moved away from distance education models where you'd get a packet of books sent to you, you'd do your work and you'd send the essay back. We moved to online. That skill set over 12 years ended up being the muscle we needed when we needed to jump online as a result of COVID. We had the team, we had the skill, we had the experience. We moved our whole college online in 4.5 days. Start to finish, 4.5 days. 900 learning units were shifted to online in 4.5 days. That was absolutely a result of 12 years of investment, 12 years of innovation, the skills, experience, the team, our education technologies team knew where to press the button. They understood what happened after you press the button, and our students had the resilience and they were supported to move online. It happened and we were successful and our college survived. After that came communication. We had a disparate team. Like cockroaches, when you turn the light on, everyone ran to their homes. We had to. We had the first lockdown. Sorry, bad example. But everybody went home. Our students went to online, our teachers went online, our staff were behind the screens. I lived behind the screens. We had bookcase wars where people were comparing bookcases in the background, but we had a business where 550 staff and 4,000 students suddenly couldn't see each other. Surveys told us that people were having informal coffees, people were organising lunches. That was great, except we knew we had a group that were completely disconnected. They were outliers, and it wasn't their fault, but they had been lost in the rush to go online. So I knew we needed to do something. We instituted something simple, and yet it became very powerful, which were weekly webinars. So like a TV programmer, same day every week, same time every week, we host a half-hour weekly webinar, sometimes it leaks to an hour, where we literally update the team on everything that's going on in the college. So I'm the main presenter, but we have guest presenters, thankfully. We have about 100 attendees to every one of these. We have another 100 who watch the recording because they're teaching or they can't make it. And the feedback has been that this has helped people get through this crisis. They disappeared into their rooms, they disappeared into their homes, but they knew that every Thursday at 11 o'clock, including today, every Thursday at 11 o'clock, I'm going to turn up on their screen. And I'm going to welcome them, and I'm going to talk about their achievements, and I'm going to talk about what's happening around the college, and I'm going to talk about what is coming up. And they're going to be updated, and for everybody that can't attend, the PowerPoints are always shared, the presentation and the video recording is always shared. This small thing created a connection within our college, and it kept us connected when we were at such risk of being disconnected. And my last point is about culture. It's often said, Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. That's not true. I researched it, but it's a good story. Peter Drucker focused on leadership and culture as foundations in any business. What we've been focusing on for the last 3.5 years that I've been at the college is actually building a culture where we are there for a greater good. We impact society. We have a calling. We don't have a job. We know through our graduates we will have a lasting impact on our community, on the broader society, much bigger than any other impact we could have. I've been a lawyer, I've sold coffee, I've done things, but I've never had the impact I'm having now. I'm not in the classroom, I don't teach, but I know we have a culture that recognises we are having an impact beyond our four walls, and therefore that job is a calling. Whether you're in a professional function or an academic function, you feel the same, and that is our culture at ACAP. What that did was help us get through when everything else went out the window, when strategy was paused, when we didn't know what was going to come through the door the next day. Culture got us through because we all believed that we had a calling and we were still willing to do it through the screen, and that was much stronger than anything our position description could say, and it was much stronger than any document I could produce. We believed we were contributing to something that was beyond our four walls. Our culture got us through when everything else fell apart. We're lucky today. The shop is okay. The college is doing well, our numbers are up, the team are connected and they feel good. But we had a 12-month period where, had we not had the culture, had we not focused on communications, and had we not had the adaptability, we really would have fallen over as an organisation, and we would have gone the way of so many organisations that had bigger challenges than us, but that fell apart because I think they didn't have those three elements. And if I can say, we were lucky enough to be in a sector that recognises and values evidence-based research, and that helped us too. So that's my story.
It's a really fantastic story. Thank you so much, George, and thank you for being so candid. It makes me think very deeply about how organisations have had to, in the words of Malcolm Turnbull, pivot and be agile. We've actually had to work out what those words mean practically, haven't we, as a direct result of the pandemic. And it's great to see how this applied approach has paid off. We're now going to hand over to ACAP's Dr. Timothy C., who's a renowned lecturer in the discipline of counselling. Dr. C is based in South Australia, and he's going to be providing important insights surrounding the fourth industrial revolution. So thanks very much, Tim.
Thank you, Margot, and thanks, George, for sharing with us that very, very inspiring story of how ACAP managed the transitions, especially during such a period of time. Hi everyone, my name's Tim. Like what Margot shared, I'm based in South Australia, Adelaide. And well, let me just share with us very quickly about the fourth industrial revolution that we all talk about. Some of us hear about this fourth industrial revolution that some of us may think, oh, it's in the future. But the actual reality that the fourth industrial revolution is actually here right now where we are. So the question for us really is about how do we then future-proof ourselves? How do we learn to respond to all these changes that is going to continually come at us? Just like how George shared with us, that when the changes was imposed on us as an organization and as individuals within that organization, how did we then respond in such a way that allowed the organization to thrive, and at the same time to give individuals the opportunity to be able to moderate and to regulate themselves. Let me just share this picture, this diagram to all of us very quickly. Now, this is sort of like a picture of the four industrial revolutions. Started off in the 17th or 18th century, where Industry 1.0 is about where things are mechanization, steam engine, the weaving iron. Now that started in the 18th century, which led to the 19th century, which is Industry 2.0, where it's about mass production, it's about assembly line and electrical energy. Now that was the 19th century. Of course, moving on to the 20th century, that maybe just do a bit of a quick history. Typically, we always talk, for those of us who are history buffs, I'm a little bit of that. We'll talk about the two wars, World War I and World War II, that of course we know that at the end of the day, the Allies won the war, and we always talked about how, or people talk about how, oh, it's because of the Allies and they have good strategies and all that. That is part of the truth. To me, the real truth is that the Allies won the war because the US at the time, in the 40s, 42 to 44, their industry, their ability to churn out more tanks, more bullets, more weapons was the key component that helped them to win the war. So it was because the US was the juggernaut when it came to Industry 2.0. So that, of course, we moved to Industry 3. That was somewhere between 1960s onwards to around 2000. And this is where the computers started coming around. Now, with the computers, if those of you were old enough to remember that in the 80s, we have Apple computers. I remember that very, very quickly, just to share a very quick story. I remember I was in my teens at that time, and one of my friends had an Apple II computer, and almost every weekend we went to his place, we played computer games on the Apple. It was fun. And one of my friends was saying that, oh man, this is the top of technology. Nothing can beat that. Now, that was in the 80s. Look at where we are today. I'm talking to you from Adelaide, and all of you are in Sydney. Now, Industry 4.0 is where we are today. We talk about cyber systems, we talk about Internet of Things, we talk about networks. Now, if I may just give a very quick illustration of how we have responded in terms of our jobs, in terms of our careers. Industry 1 and 2 is very much like we were sitting on a train where our career paths, our jobs, there's only one job. We stayed in that job or in the organization all our life because that was the expectation. So the train driver had full control of the journey that you had in terms of your careers, in terms of your job. So and that was the expected thing. In Industry 3, this is where in the 80s and 90s, it was like riding a bus. Now, things changed slightly because at the time with all these different changes that came about, careers and jobs became what we call a series of events where it is okay to now transfer from one bus to another. So likewise, it is okay for people to start to sort of change different company, but it could still stay in the same industry. But at the end of the day, it is still the bus driver of that particular bus that is still directing us. So likewise, in companies and organizations, the careers were planned by the organizations, not the individual. But in Industry 4.0, where we are today, it is very much more like piloting a drone. When we pilot a drone, we are in control right now. We are in control of your career journey. You are doing what is necessary. So in a way, we respond to changes in the environment. And this is where we are today. about being adaptable and the stuff that which George just shared with us. It is looking at the environment, it is responding to the changes, and we move and we pivot ourselves rapidly in response to the environment. So that is really the background to Industry 4.0. So let me just share with us some tips on how do we then future-proof ourselves in the midst of Industry 4.0. And some people are already talking about Industry 5. Well, we'll talk about it later on. So now, how do we future-proof ourselves? My suggestion for us is to adopt what we call the STAR approach. What is STAR? STAR, S for self-assessments. I'll share all this in a short while. T for technological or technology adoption. A is to be adaptable or to have the sense of the agility to manage all those changes. And R is reinvention. Let me do a very quick brief of what self-assessment is all about. Now, before maybe if you allow me, I'm just going to do a very quick advertisement, for ACAP. We've just launched the careers program, and as part of this careers program which I'm teaching, we always start off by teaching students and even the people we work with, the clients, that before we do anything, we always start with a self-assessment, finding out what your VIPS is all about. What is VIPS? It is your values, it is your interests, it is your personality, and it is your skills. So it's always important to start knowing where we are before we respond to the future. Let me give us a very quick example, just using around values, for example. Now, it's important for us to know what values are because all of us are driven and motivated by certain values which are important to us. And likewise, it's the same thing for organizations. George mentioned how as an organization, ACAP adapted because of the culture, because of the focus on people, being human. That is a value. Let me share with us a story. I'm sure quite a few of us probably are still familiar with the brand Kodak, right? So those of us, again, if we lived long enough, we know, yeah, Kodak is that film company where we grew up with taking pictures and all the films and all that. Now, in 2012, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. Now, what happened in terms of this bankruptcy was because Kodak, for them, there were sacred cows in the company. There are certain lines of revenues that should not be touched. But the problem was the world was moving into a digital space, but they didn't adapt. They didn't move fast enough. For them, these lines must remain. Now, another company, which I'm sure all of us are familiar with, Fujifilm. Now, Fujifilm experienced the same levels of disruptions as well in terms of digital, but what they did differently, because they were driven by their values. And the values, one of the Fujifilm values was innovation. So what happened was, instead of going the way of Kodak, where they remained steadfast and rigid and immovable, Fujifilm changed. Fujifilm adapted. They innovated using the technologies that they have. So instead of just focusing on film, what happened is from 2012 to 2017, the revenues went up fivefold. It's interesting. So one of the things, I'm not sure if any of you know, I'm not sure if any of you heard of this particular cosmetic brand by the name of Staffled. Now, Staffled is one of the products, which is cosmetic, that's produced by Fujifilm. Now, if you look at it, what has cosmetics got to do with a company like Fujifilm that focuses on films? Well, the key thing is they had the technology, they had the knowledge, but they used that knowledge, they innovated, they put that knowledge into a new product that drove the revenue for them. And in the past 3 years or so, Fujifilm has also gone into pharmaceuticals. And right now they are doing research on creating solutions to deal with cancer, with Alzheimer's and all that. Now that really gives us a very clear indication of how values drive an organization. I want to do a very quick example right now for all of us. Now on your chairs, and for those of you online, that there's a list of all these values. Now, I just wanted for all of us to look at this list of values, just a very quick exercise, and just maybe look at these values and ask ourselves, choose two of these values. As you read, you realize these two values are really the primary motivator or the driver of how you live your life. So right now, I'd just like us to take maybe about 15 seconds to 20 seconds. Just choose two of these values. And in a short while, I'm going to do a very quick exercise where those of you in the physical space, I'll just like you to talk to each other very quickly. So go ahead and take a look at this screen. Okay, now that you've chosen the two values, I'll let all of you in the physical space, if possible, within social distancing, just to find someone on your left or on your right, and just for 30 seconds each, just share with each other the values that you chose, and just very quickly, why is it that these values are important to you? So I'll invite all of you in the physical space just to do this short little exercise, and for those of you online, have a conversation with yourself, why these values are important to yourself. Just go ahead, everyone, for just 1 minute. All right, 30 seconds is up, so it's time to change over. If your partners haven't had a chance to share, let them have a chance to share as well. All right, regrettably, the 1 minute is up. It's just too quick, isn't it? Now, I just want to carry on. Now, for those of you who had a chance to share, do you notice how excited your partners were or the group mates were in sharing their values? That gives us an indicator that all of us are driven by certain values. If I may just give a very quick example in terms of personal values. Imagine if I'm not sure if any one of you have talked about family. I'm not sure if family is, but I'll give you an example. Imagine if family is a top value for you, meaning to say everything that you do revolves around your family. Your job, the paid job that you do, the volunteer work that you do, everything revolves around that. Now imagine next week when you go back to your office or your bosses come to you and say, look, we've got this exciting project that's going to come up. We're going to pay you more money for that. And this project requires you to travel overseas, even though we're right now we can't travel in Australia, get out of international travels. But the boss says, we will make arrangements for you to travel out. So, but unfortunately, your family can't go with you. So for 1 year, you're going to be out there in some exotic place doing this business line for us, but your family can't be with you. Now, looking at just this example, ask yourself, if family is your top value, how likely would it be that you will take up this job role? If you were like me, chances are probably not. Because if family are my top values, even though you offer me an exciting opportunity, I probably won't, because if my family can't go with me, what's the point? So just this very simple example shows how important values are for all of us. So as a starting point, we need to do self-assessment to figure out our VIPS, our values, our interests, our personality, and our skills. Of course, there are many activities for I, P, and S. So again, if any of you are interested, we've launched our course. You could actually sign up and maybe come along, join us in this course, and I can teach all of you what kind of tools and approaches to help yourself and your clients to figure out your VIPS. Now, let me just go on to the others. So the other part will be in terms of T for technological adoption. Now, we know that technology is where Industry 4.0 is all about. So we talk about how it's cyber physical systems, we talk about Internet of Things, we talk about artificial intelligence. Now, all of us are very familiar with technology today. Now, about 5 years ago, the Committee for Economic Development Australia did a research, and the shocking result was this, that by 2030, that's barely 9 years from now, by 2030, up to a possibility of 40%, that's 40% of jobs in Australia may be lost to technological advancement. Now that's shocking. It's 40%. Can you imagine that? And that's just barely 9 years from now. Now, in terms of that percentage or the data, just look at it in terms of how over the past 5 years, Just look at the self-checkout counters that has popped up in Kohl's and Woolies all across the nation in just 5 years. When the self-checkout counters, which is technology disruption, was first introduced, a lot of people were very, very uncomfortable with that. A lot of people, no, I'm going to stick to the usual checkout counter where I can speak to the person, we can have a conversation, but this is what Aussie life is all about. But we realized over time that the adopters, those who were comfortable, shifted to make use of the self-checkout counters. So the early adopters did that, and things went really well. It became very smooth. But looking at that, that really was how technology shifted things around. It is how we respond effectively to technology. So it's important for us as a nation to recognize that there are all this resistance to technological adoption, but we have to overcome that as part of the ability to adapt. Now, Robert Half, one of the recruitment companies, found that up to 33% of organizations and individuals are resistant to change because for them, this whole idea of changing and adopting technology now is something I want to do. So there's 1 out of every 3 people who will not want to change because they find that it is too hard. So that is really a challenge for all of us today, that being able to adopt or adapt to technology really will help us to future-proof ourselves. Now, the third point in terms of, let me just go down to the next screen. Where's my mouse? The point about adaptability. Now, if I may just share a very quick definition, is the ability to regulate our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors in response to the changing environment. So the environment changes, but adaptability is how we emotionally, behaviorally, and even our thoughts, how we regulate those thoughts in the midst of adaptability. So George earlier mentioned that when COVID hit us, we had 4 days as the organizations to adapt, to shift 900 over courses online. Now that is really a demonstration of adaptability. Instead of whining and whinging, which I guess most of us probably will do, maybe George, some of us probably whine and whinge about it, but those of us, we recognize that there is a need for us to adapt. There is a need for us to moderate those emotions. There is a need for us to put all those negative thoughts aside and look at this challenge of adapting head on, face it, deal with it, and move everything online. And 1 year later, like what George is sharing with all of us, we are in a much better place because we managed to adopt and to adapt. So I think that is something I'd like to encourage all of us listeners, that we have, we started off with self-assessment, knowing what your values, your interests, your personality, and your skills are. And then the second part is adapting technology. The third thing is knowing how to adapt. And finally, just very, very quickly, now this picture, which I'm sure many of us are very familiar with who this individual is Madonna. Now, looking at these pictures from the left to right, these are the pictures of Madonna from 80s, 90s, noughties, 2010, and today, 2021, 2020s. If you notice Madonna, up to today, every decade, she reinvented herself. She changed her looks. She modified her songs. She looked at what the trends were in terms of the market, and she adapted and she reinvented herself to make herself relevant to what's happening out there. So that's why we talk about it. In the 80s, when Material Girl came out, and today, I don't know what song it is, but we still hear, well, I'm not so much in touch with songs now, but we can see how powerful Madonna kept herself relevant. Now, that is the fourth component of future-proofing, that reinvention. How do we as organizations and individuals continue to reinvent ourselves in response to the change and response to all these challenges and disruptions that are in the face of us? So to just wrap up this very quick presentation, in order for us to respond, in order for us to future-proof ourselves in terms of Industry 4, or maybe in the future Industry 5, is about knowing how to adopt STAR into our lives, both individually as well for our organizations, to do a self-assessment, to know what our VIPS is or are, adopt technology, be adaptable, and continually reinvent ourselves so that we can face the challenges coming up ahead of us. So thank you everyone for listening to me. Back to you, Margot.
Aspects of your talk. One was to do with values, which I think is very topical during a pandemic. We have to think about our values, what we actually believe in. And I'm really interested in the concept of my career being, I'm like a drone pilot. And at the moment I'm looking for a co-pilot. So all these ideas are fantastic. Thank you so much. We all have to manage our careers ourselves. So it's wonderful to see all of these practical examples as well of how we can future-proof our careers and our organisations. And the VIP analogy has made me think about, you know, my values and interests as well as the values and interests of the people around me and the country we live in. This has been food for thought. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to open up for any questions and answers from people out there on the webinar. Please send some questions in. If there's anybody in the audience who'd like to ask a question. While we're waiting for the questions to come in, I'll just ask for Tim and for George. How do I actually practically future-proof my career?
I think it's one for Tim.
Tim.
What a good way, George. Well, for me, the idea of future-proofing myself or individuals, like what I mentioned earlier, the important thing is just to ensure that we always have this future-oriented mindset. But we don't have to, the point for me is, and as we do coaching for clients, is not to wait for technology to catch up with us, but to always be 1 or 2 steps ahead. If I may just use a very quick example of Nokia. I'm sure all of us are familiar with Nokia. That in the early 2000s, if you use Nokia phones, that we are probably very comfortable with that. But unfortunately, with the technological changes, Nokia didn't foresee that coming. But what happened was that when the technology changed, they were left behind. So the important thing for us to future-proof ourselves is always to have the future-oriented mindset and to adopt STAR into our whole mental space so that we're always prepared for what's to come.
Mm-hmm. And what in terms, for all of us, I mean, we work in different areas, but we all have kind of core skills.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what would be the most valuable areas to upskill in terms of the things you've been studying?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very clear-cut answer. It's about digitization. It's about technology. Just yesterday, last night, in fact, I was just watching this YouTube video, and it was it's a YouTube video of an 81-year-old woman in Japan. Now, 81. I'm just thinking, what will I be doing when I'm 81 years old? But she's 81, and she learned how to do coding. Wow. She coded apps for people of a generation. In fact, it was interesting because for her, she recognized that the ability to code these apps on a mobile phone and to communicate this is some traditional narrative and stuff which is culturally based, that she was able to enable the whole generation of her peers to keep their minds active. And she was now starting to teach them how to code as well, because her perspective is this, that we're in the 21st century. We need to have these skills to respond to the technological disruptions. Instead of just being a consumer, I think one of the skills for us here in Australia is, of course, I'm not expecting all of us to learn coding, but my recommendation for us is to begin to be open to technology. Just like, for example, I was just looking at mobile phones, that how many of us have the latest apps in terms of communication? In fact, many of us are still using the good old SMS. But I'm sure some of us are probably aware that right now that there's this whole thing about WhatsApp, that WhatsApp, people are shifting away from WhatsApp, going to this app called Signal or even Telegram. So the question for all of us is, in terms of adopting of technology, is do we have that mindset? So one of the important skills in preparation for that is get ourselves into the space, upskill ourselves, maybe learn some coding, or create this opportunity for us to be very comfortable in that digital space as a very important core skill moving on from here.
So quite possibly in Japan, if you're 81, you're not considered old. That may be the median age of all Japanese. So
it could be.
There'd be tremendous incentive there to teach your peers, wouldn't there?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, George, I'd like to ask you, what are the next steps that I should take to align with my values? This is a values-led organisation, so how should I put that into practice?
Look, we hire for values. It was interesting what Tim said about digitisation. When I look at a resume, I make assumptions about your skills, I make assumptions about your level of digital nativity. I don't I make assumptions that you are built a certain way from a skills perspective, but your values need to be clear. I've been lucky enough to recruit a lot of people in my career. Your values need to be clear. They need to shine, they need to come out during the interview, and they need to be authentic. If you're clear about your values, whether it's through taking the test that Tim has suggested, whether it's through getting a deeper understanding of yourself, a bit of self-reflection to understand who you are, when your values are clear, you will find the organisation that matches you, and the organisation will find you. You will respond to the values of the organisation. Our current campaign, which is a recruitment campaign for students, is actually having the effect of recruiting people who want to work for us because they can see our values coming through in our campaign and they want to work for us. This is what values does. It's a filtering mechanism. The recommendation I can say to anybody is find out what they are. There are a multitude of online tools. Tim has shared one with us today. A multitude of online tools that helps you understand your values. I know for careers counsellors at high school, they talk a lot about the values so that a young mind can start to understand what that means. Not just aptitude, not just the ability to repeat, but actually understanding your values and, if I may, how they evolve over time. Your values at 20 and 30 and 40, they shift. So if you have a deep understanding of your values, you will project that, and an employer, I believe these days, values that more and more.
If you're looking at a CV that's come across your desk, what would jump out to you in terms of signifying values? What would you be looking for?
It's fair to say that the written word is a challenge. You know, we're not all authors, we're not Bronte, we don't have that skill set. So it is going to be the case that the values are going to come through perhaps in how you describe your contribution to your previous roles. Replicating your position description is not a very good CV. It doesn't tell you anything. But talking about what you did, how you impacted your colleagues, how you impacted the organisation, how you have impacted those around you tells me something about your values. And your voice, your tone of voice in that written document tells me something about you. It is a limited science there though. It's all going to come out in the interview. So it's a challenge for the applicant. The applicant has to convey skills, experience and values as best they can in a black and white format, but then in person is where we're going to know whether we have a winner or not.
In an interview, is it appropriate to ask someone about their life outside of work as a way of ascertaining what those values are, or are you circumscribed by the limits of an interview situation?
I would hope an applicant who's driven by values shares that anyway. I would like to think that given the opportunity, and every interview on this planet will have the open question at the end, I would hope that an individual who's confident about their values, driven by their values, will share that and will not be contained by the artificiality of an interview.
Mm-hmm. And would it be a cliche to talk about, volunteering or...
Not at all.
No.
Not at all. They're real. Volunteering is your time. I'm fortunate enough to serve a couple of charities. I serve as chairman for one and on the board for another. This is an expression of my values. This is how I do it. I contribute in the way that I'm good. I wouldn't be good in a soup kitchen. I will make a mess and drop everything, but I know I can contribute my skill set to that organisation so that it can grow and it can impact more people than it does today. That is a very valid thing to bring into the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Margot, may I jump in and just add on to what George mentioned, say something? Now, one of the things I want to sort of emphasize is this. when we talk about careers, most people think about careers as that paid job that we're doing. But careers is more than a paid job. Careers includes all the things that we do outside of a paid job. So we have roles in our lives, like we are a parent, we are a son or a daughter, we are a volunteer, we are doing all these other spaces. And like what George correctly mentioned, that if we are clear about our values, that value that we have will drive all the different aspects of our career lifeline. So that's why it's important for us all to enable our students, our children, our peers, the whole nation to really understand what are some of the driving factors within them. So that is why we are so passionate about careers development. And we want to really educate as many people, not just only career practitioners, but anyone with the ability and the skill to facilitate this discussion so that as a whole nation, we can start moving towards the future.
Speaking of the future, Tim, what you mentioned the fifth revolution. Can you tell us what you think the fifth revolution looks like?
Well, do you remember Terminator? The very first scene of Terminator, I remember years ago when I watched that, I was like shocked, and I was a small kid. And that's robotics, it's AI. But I think in the fifth industrial revolution is where AI integrates with our human brain. Elon Musk is talking about that already. He's talking about how AI could, in the future, be integrated as part of who we are. It's not that AI will overtake us, but it is really integrated and augmenting who we are as humans, so that we are able to, like Matrix, you can plug in that software, and within 5 seconds, we learn how to pilot a plane, something like that. So I'm just crystal ball gazing, but I think that's probably what's going to happen for Industry 5.0.
That's going to be interesting in terms of values, isn't it? I mean, how do you import values into AI?
We just plug it in.
We actually have one of our professors, Professor Mike Innes in Adelaide. He does a lot of research in AI, and his interest area is that intersection between psychology and artificial intelligence, things like the psychology of programming. How do you train programmers to build humane aspects into their code? And of course, what Tim's talking about, integration. We will live side by side with artificial intelligence. Today it's invisible, tomorrow it will be visible, and we will integrate with it. Fascinating areas of research. And Ben Morrison and Mike Innes, look up their research. It's incredible on what they think is coming. It's a question for both of you. We've all been disrupted. Is this a good time to change careers, or should we just be trying to sort of hang on to what we've got?
George, it's your turn now.
Look, I can take this one. I like to think that in life, you've got a few variables, and let's use the metaphor, they're balls in the air. I would ask how many you want to be in the air at once. And for some of us, we want to have 2 or 3 that are stable and 1 that we change. For others, we want to change everything. You've got to understand your tolerance for that level of ambiguity and your tolerance for that level of change. But I think if you apply that metaphor, that's probably a way to assess whether it's time for you to change or not.
So get a good assessment of your tolerance for change, and then work it out from there.
Yeah. I also recommend to people to write it down. It's such a very simple but powerful thing. Write down the things that you don't want to change, write down the things that you do, and see whether one list is bigger than the other.
How does the physical act of writing something down change the way you think about things?
I'm lucky enough to be surrounded by lots of really smart psychology professors who will do a better job answering that, but I know it's very powerful.
So let's look back at the beginning of COVID, which was only a year ago. I mean, it seems like 20 years ago, but it was only 1 year ago. If you had to do it all again in terms of your work career, in terms of ACAP and what you've done here as CEO, if you had to do it all again, would you do anything differently?
No, not at all. Everything that we did in the last 12 months was a result of things that occurred 12 years ago, 3 years ago, was a result of smart thinking well before this occurred. We built our muscles well before we needed them, and then when we needed them, they were there. So I'd have to say that this wasn't a easy journey. There were bumps along the way. There were days that hurt, and there were days that were amazing. But the journey is the one we had, and I can't see another way that we would have done it better. And for the team that I'm working with, I can't see how anybody being different in that group would have made a difference at all. There is nothing I would change.
Mm-hmm. The CEO has traditionally been seen as a pillar of strength, the person at the top who has to make all the hard decisions. But George, also there's a role there for showing vulnerability to your staff as well, and to the students. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a place for it. It's probably a better commentary from others than from me, but certainly I believe there's a place for it. I say that because I do it. So whether it's in a personal forum, whether it's in the company-wide blog, I share the challenges that I've had, but I share them so that people understand that all of us have our own journey to get through this. COVID has impacted us in many different ways. Today I'm here to talk about the organisation, but as an individual, I've had a COVID impact, and I've had a return from a COVID impact, and it's actually a story I shared at work. So I think there's room for vulnerability. I think there's a lot of room for authenticity in being a leader. I've got a role to play, but I'm also a human, and it's okay to share both.
Mm-hmm. What's the role here of perhaps for everyone to be able to admit that they've made mistakes and what they've learned from it? Do you think that's also very important?
Every day of the week, 100%. My own journey has been all mistakes. That's how I've learnt. I like to think that we're an organisation that embraces mistakes. We recover from them. We make them every day. And if we're going to learn from this, if we're going to get better as an organisation, we have to embrace them. We have to capture them. We have to be brave about acknowledging them. And once we do, I think we get better.
Yeah, Margot, could I just share an observation from as a staff within ACAP? Now, how many CEOs find themselves in a firing line by putting themselves in a Facebook chat where we have hundreds of students there? Now, very few CEOs will do that. So George is there inspiring us by showing his humanity and showing his humility to be able to respond to students. And when students complain about stuff that's happening, George will listen to them, and George said, okay, let me look into this. And of course, he will then challenge the rest of the team in ACAP to respond. Now, that to me is very inspiring because it demonstrates to us the need for us to be listening to our students, to our stakeholders, to show that we are vulnerable, but at the same time that we are taking responsibility for ourselves and for the organization. So that's something which I'm really inspired by. And at the same time, because of what George is demonstrating, I do that the same thing for my students as well. I show my vulnerability, where if I do not know anything, I'll just say, look, I don't know, let me find out, and I'll come back to you. Now, this way, it gives the students the confidence that this lecturer is not just doing something else, but the lecturer is really showing his vulnerability and his humanity. And that comes back to what George mentioned about ACAP as an organization. We are human, because what we are doing is we are trying to communicate to our stakeholders and to people out there that we are training students so that one day, when they graduate from our courses, when they become a psychologist, when they're a counselor, when they're a therapist, they demonstrate this same value that we're talking across. So that over time, our hope and our dream is that all the clients that our students who are practitioners will meet, they will also be in turn impacted by the same values as well.
Well, that seems like an absolutely fantastic place to wrap up. Thank you so much. Thank you for your great responses to our questions and all of our, it's been absolutely fascinating. Now I thought we'd take a look back at 2020 and forward to this year. It's hard to believe that we're already in February. It's almost a year since the pandemic started, and we're focusing on the topics we've touched on today to provide real-life context and real-life examples of how to do that. So that wraps it up. So thanks again to our wonderful panellists, to George and to Timothy. Thank you very much. From the Australian College of Applied Psychology. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the third of a 4-part speaker series, ACAP's inaugural Get Equipped series. This event will be available for download following this event, and the link will be on ACAP's Facebook. Thank you very much.